Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tabletop RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons are a great way to just relax with some friends and have a little bit of a challenge while crafting a story. Though sometimes a DM might want to challenge their players a little bit more than usual, and while this is a great way to take your players through the ringer, sometimes you gotta be careful not to take things too far, much like what happens in this next D&D horror story. But first, if you do enjoy my videos, I ask that you like, comment, subscribe, and even share it with your friends, as it goes a long way to help this Doge out and appease the algorithm dragon. But with that out of the way, let's get right into the story. D&D 5e, but Dark Souls difficulty in Surprise BDSM, by Reddit user Ashton Cadwell. Content warning: BDSM, non-consented. Sometimes it's your good friends who run the worst games. Unfortunately for me, he was also the person who introduced me to D&D, and until I joined an online play-by-post game, the only source of a regular game I had. I spoke with him over some of the issues I had, but he'd often deny or justify away the complaints. We are no longer friends, but it's not due to D&D. We were promised the Sunless Citadel, and had some homebrew quests to fulfill before we could actually go to the Sunless Citadel. The group included a mountain dwarf paladin, his new girlfriend, a turtle wizard, a half-orc fighter, a half-elf rogue, and myself, a dwarven cleric. His roommate would later join us as a noble human variant fighter. I had a new character, Harbeck, cleric brother to the DM's girlfriend's paladin. I refer to my character as Beck for short. The first call of order was a village that was being plagued with bandits. These bandits would cast a town-wide sleep spell, and then pillage what they could while most of the residents remained asleep. We were tasked with seizing and protecting the town cleric's magical artifact. The cleric herself went missing before the adventure started, and we were told our duty was of utmost importance. The DM had us toil through 2 combat encounters with too many bandits that half the party was downed at least once during the first fight. You can imagine the disappointment when he plunged us into a second encounter. Somehow, the party pulled through and entered the second level of the inn, where we seized the magical artifact. At this point, as players, we disagreed about the best approach. I advocated for leaving town because if there's a town-wide sleep spell, then we're best situated outside. But the others thought we could hide, and have our elf guard the artifact and be okay. Throwing 2 combat encounters with what sounds like way too many enemies at level 1 characters without at least a short rest in between? Oh man, I would call that red flag number 1 right there. Night came, and the DM started narrating how we all got lulled into the effects of the sleep spell. The elven rogue player protested and was allowed to roll to see if he passed a con check. He rolled an 18 and was still put to sleep. The party woke up to the artifact missing and the inn up in flames with the only exit being the window. Great. This is another red flag. Elves have Fey ancestry, which means that they have advantage on saving throws against being charmed, and the final part of that is that they can't be magically put to sleep. So they shouldn't have had to even make a con save against that, and then rolling an 18 and still being put to sleep? It sounds like this DM was showing the beginning signs of railroading. Let's continue. Defeated and slightly charred, the party headed to the local tavern to try and get a lead on where the bandits went. We toiled around and asked NPCs for an out-of-game hour or so. The DM's girlfriend was literally looking at his DM notes and saying he should just give us the information, but he told her we hadn't asked the right people the right questions. She pouted and then he gave us the information. The bandits were hiding out in the forest across the creek. We were now tasked with both locating the missing cleric and retrieving her magical artifact. Once we reach the forest, the DM describes a clearing and that we can glimpse the creek not far off. The wizard moves to the creek and, surprise, the ground under him caves into a pitfall trap that we had no chance or a way of seeing. His wizard falls prone. One of the PCs mentioned that they have a passive perception of 15, to which the DM explained that, well, he doesn't like passive perception and how it's a guaranteed success, so he doesn't use it. Of course, once the pitfall triggered, a swarm of bandits appeared out of the trees and we had to have another encounter. We reached the creek. It was a shallow river of walkable depth. I was suspicious at this point and asked for a perception roll. There are some, quote, thingies swimming in the water, the DM explained. I asked what they are. He refused to elaborate and said that the water is a bit murky. My cleric used his light cantrip on a pebble and tossed it into the water. This cantrip is meant to illuminate up to 20 feet of bright light, and he denied any more clarification, quote, because. The party, seeing no other way of crossing the creek, waded through. DM asked us to roll a 1d4 just because. Anyway, it turned out that there were leeches latched onto us, and we took that 1d4 damage for the number of leeches, where each leech would suck out 1 damage regardless of armor or clothing. It's also worth noting that the detect trap spell doesn't work at all in the universe because house rules. When the party finally found the magical artifact in the missing cleric, the cleric was furious at us for letting the bandit take it. She cursed us into withering away or the like unless we could find a magical remedy for it before the next new moon, i.e. the enchanted apple in the Sunless Citadel. The party headed for the Sunless Citadel, and we stopped at a small town to investigate suspicious individuals sneaking around. The party split, and it was my cleric and the rogue who combed through the library, and the paladin, the fighter, and the wizard who checked out the residential homes. At the library, my cleric noticed a group of robed figures who rounded a corner and seemingly disappeared. He solved a puzzle and found a secret entrance that he and the rogue entered. This is funny, because you wouldn't think that entering a secret entrance literally means having sex, especially in a game where more than half of the players were recruited from a D&D Facebook group, and no one consented to sexual content that there wouldn't be any explicit scenes. We witnessed someone on all fours between 2 others, someone crucified naked, and the sound of someone getting flogged. The rogue player was visibly uncomfortable, and I was disgusted. The people having sex noticed us and either started reaching for their weapons or closing in on us, which I thought was unlikely, because how many times will people go as far as a secret dungeon to hide their kinks, but still resort to furiously pursuing those who stumble in? Wouldn't most people cover up in embarrassment and yell at the party to leave? Why would you even spring your kink on a group of players who never said they wanted to know about it? This is one thing I have noticed as a theme in a lot of these Dungeons & Dragons horror stories. Listen, having kinks is normal for a lot of people, and it's never right to kink shame people who play them out in private. But for God's sakes, don't ever force it on other people, whether it be in real life or in a tabletop RPG. This is why Session 0 is so important. You gotta lay the groundwork for what players and DMs are to expect in a game. And if the DM knew he was planning a scene like this, it's up to him to make sure that all players consent to stuff like this being in this game. But I digress. My cleric and the rogue narrowly managed to flee, while some of the pursuers towards the back of the chase sequence started slinging spells at us. The party regrouped to reapproach the situation after the others couldn't find any leads. When we went back into the dungeon, we found it largely empty, except for the equipment and some books. These books were, quote, splattered with a white substance. Dude, seriously? That's fucking gross. And my cleric promptly burnt them all at a distance with Sacred Flame. The DM initially tried to have me roll for dex to avoid having the fluid splatter on my cleric or something, but I explained that Sacred Flame has a 30-foot range. We private messaged about this after the session, and he mentioned that he was, quote, hurting his soul after I had the books burnt. He argued they, quote, weren't soaked, just splattered and sticky, and that, quote, one person's sacrilege is another's fervent worship, which disgusted me to no end. He agreed not to spring his kinks into the group in the future. Despite the surprise BDSM, the party continued. We caught wind of some special artifacts in an abandoned wizard's tower and went to investigate. After puzzling through the main chamber and picking up some potions plus a handful of small trinkets, but nothing proportionately rewarding for the amount of travel and work it took to reach the tower in the first place, we checked out the rooftop. There was a bandit captain and his underling who immediately engaged us in combat. We were a group of 4 level 2 players. The bandit captain had 2 ranged attacks with his knives and 1 melee attack with a sword every turn. The underling had 2 attacks, could combine ranged and melee. We managed to kill the underling, but this gave the captain advantage on all of his attacks for 1d4 rounds because, quote, that underling was his brother. We had 4 PCs who could attack once each per round, excluding Action Surge. we had a cumulative health pool of about 50, whereas the bandits had 5 attacks per round between them, an AC of about 18 for the captain, and a combined health pool of 50 plus from broad after game estimates. It got to the point that our casters were out of spell slots, our martial classes were downed, and it was impossible to win despite fairly good rolls on the whole from our party. Our only option that wasn't being TPK'd was my cleric begging the bandits to spare the party's lives if he'd given his late brother an honorable and blessed burial. The bandit agreed, so long as he could also take his share of the loot from the party. I planned to stall the burial until dawn, where Lathander's connection to his cleric would be the strongest, and finally wipe out the captain, but the DM denied me despite numerous successful deception rolls, even with disadvantage. The entire group was seething by the end of it. We continued our journey. While on a mountain path, I had a hunch there was something wrong. Roll for perception. I rolled a 19 without modifiers, and all I saw was, quote, some landscaping, which of course turned out to be enemies hiding in the distance, with an extended pitfall trap on the 1x12 corridor/cliff edge to reach them. Complete bullshit trap you can't even avoid. Nice. After some hobgoblins and goblins attacked, the DM decided to add in some random eagles to attack us. We were in low health but managed to scrape by when the paladin, quote, suddenly had the ground cave in under her feet and fell into a cave-in inside the mountain. The party rogue had a rope on him, tied rope onto the nearest large boulder, and went down to retrieve the paladin, when the DM asked for us all to roll for initiative and had zombies attack the paladin. The rogue was forced to wait for 2 turns before he could join the fight to account for the time spent tying the rope and then sliding down, which is fine. But when the party turned to climb up the rope again, the DM decided to punish us with a convenient landslide and forced us into the catacombs in the mountain. I objected. We've been adventuring for about 2 months at this point and still weren't even close to getting to the Citadel. I asked him when we can get there. He said, quote, it's meant to take months for you to get to the Citadel, and I want you to feel like you've worked for it. I argued that travel time can be implied, but dragging it out is only going to take precious time and level up beyond the recommended 1 to 3 range for a TSC. He shrugged and said he'd deal with the problem when it came up. In the catacombs, the party reached an altar, with what looked like a small ceremonial bowl. The chaotic neutral rogue cut his finger and dripped some blood inside out of curiosity. The DM summoned 30 zombies that chased us down the corridor. The party barricaded themselves in a small room, which we made a primitive choke point with some clever thinking, salvaging material to make pseudo sandbags, piling old clothes onto the sandbags, pouring water on that, using Ray of Frost to make them icy and hard to climb, etc. We managed to dispatch of the 30 zombies without expending any potions, spell slots, or scarce once per rest resources. The DM, after conveniently forgetting to apply some penalty rolls on the zombies from our sandbag choke point, was visibly annoyed he couldn't get us to use any of our resources. And we were annoyed too, for different reasons. We left our barricade room, and there was a high ceiling room full of cobwebs. The party correctly suspected that a giant spider was hiding somewhere in it. My cleric took one of the sandbags from the choke point and threw it up into the webs to trigger the spider out of hiding on purpose. Nothing happened. The party had no choice but to proceed. Conveniently, once we all stepped into the webs, the DM had us roll for initiative, despite resourceful thinking earlier to trigger the webs beforehand. I asked the DM why he made that call, and he shrugged and smirked at me. My cleric used Radiance of the Dawn to kill the spider later, and the party took a short rest before advancing into the final room. The final room of the catacombs had a mummy who was far, far too strong for our party. It had a crown of dark magic on its head it uses to summon minions, and I had the bright idea to use radiant damage when it summoned a skeleton. The DM protested. You can't use ROTD, you just used it on the spider. I told him to look back when the clerics channeled divinity because ROTD recharges per short rest. The DM was annoyed, but let me kill off the minion and deal damage to the mummy. Later, the mummy rolled a 20 to dodge an attack, and smoothly sidestepped out of the way, ending with a ballet pirouette. Fucking excuse me? The mummy managed to curse the paladin with its rotting fist effect. No regaining HP, lose 10 HP per 24 hours. At 0 HP, turn to dust. Can only be removed with remove curse or similar. After the encounter. The DM admitted to not having read the stat block of the mummy properly, and being shocked its curse was so strong. My cleric shot the killing blow, guiding bolt, through the mummy's head and shattered the crown with a blast of radiant magic. Later, I had to leave town for family reasons and was promised that, after half a year sitting through his campaigns, the party would get into the Citadel. But the DM kept plaguing the party with encounter after encounter. I ended up needing to leave one session before the party set foot inside. I was seething and the GM didn't so much offer an apology. In fact, when I finally came back, I was told that there wasn't a canonical explanation about what happened to my character. DM decided in spur of the moment that he was imprisoned and put inside a cage soon after setting foot inside the Citadel. The party heard my character yelling in a further room, but the DM decided to make them fight for 1.5 to 2 hours, despite literally everyone in the party asking if I could be included yet. I said, "Hey man, I feel like I'm being punished for getting dragged out to chaperone my sister for something I never wanted." He said, "Kinda does, doesn't it?" and ignored later complaints. Oh man, this DM just sounds like a real asshat. I would have left right then and there. My PC was caged, with none of his weapons and possessions, with a chaotic evil gnoll cleric who for some hypocritical reason managed to keep his holy symbol. I asked where the rest of my boys' possessions were after the party came and freed my PC, and was told to roll a d20 to see how much of it I could find again. I rolled a 17 or 18 and was allowed only 2/3 of my original loot. The DM said I couldn't find my symbol either, and was going to have me fight the rest of the dungeon without it until my cleric's paladin sister made a new holy symbol for him. At that point, I didn't even bother questioning how she could have found anything vaguely holy for Lathander in that shithole of a citadel. But I kept quiet because I felt so fucking done. Anyway, the DM wouldn't let us take a short rest, and had the gnoll rat us out by screaming for guards. We ended up going through another combat grind. The session was 2 hours of me watching them fight, 15 minutes of brief roleplay, then another 1 to 2 hours of fighting more goblins. We fucking killed them, but the wizard was out of spell slots. I was left with 2 to 3, the paladin was out of lay on hands, and the fighters were pretty beaten up. The DM still had one of the goblins manage to flee the fight for whatever reason. We reached an unavoidable caltrops corridor which nearly killed the party, because who would have guessed that a lack of a short rest might really endanger a group in the middle of a dungeon. DM had a sudden change of heart in the last 1/3 of the room and said, "If you move really slowly, you can avoid taking damage altogether." Wow, thanks. Really useful to know, but we have to rest now because one hit would down literally everyone in the party. We came back after a rest and ended up needing to grind through 2 hobgoblins and 2 to 3 normal goblins, which reanimated because someone apparently kept the mummy crown despite me explicitly destroying it with guiding bolt. We even managed to keep a hobgoblin guard alive, but unconscious for questioning. But the first thing the DM did was to have one of the zombies beeline him to bite his neck. Funny, because that hobgoblin was literally in the corner of the room furthermost from the door, yet the zombie went for him. At another point in this partially zombified fight, the DM announced he rolled a nat 20 to strike the paladin and downed her for the second time in the encounter, in the first encounter of the day. The fighter's player said, quote, "You know you can fudge enemy rolls, right? So if they get a nat 20, you can change that." And the response was, quote, "Yeah, but I'm going to leave it." What the fuck? The DM also tried to curve an arrow around the doorway to hit the half-orc fighter in the group until the player himself complained, "Unless this is a magically enchanted arrow of heat-seeking, then that's just not how projectiles work." He asked the GM after the fight if any of the guards had magical weapons he could loot. "Nope, just some normal greatswords." Then when the fighters tried to take the greatswords, DM said, "You pick it up and you realize it's quite rusted from years of repair, and that it's made for globinoid hands. You feel as though you will suffer a penalty if you use this weapon." I don't know how, but the party managed to suffer and make our way to the Goblin's Royal Chamber, or whatever's the closest equivalent in their terms. There was all this description for the heavy door to the Goblin's leader's chamber. Initiative. And my cleric tried to use the door as cover, and he made it, quote, "vanish just because." Increasingly frequent throughout the campaign after I returned to town, I noticed that the DM was constantly misgendering Harbeck because, quote, "Beck sounds like a girl's name," despite his sister character calling him brother, and despite him calling himself the firstborn son of Anaheim clan. We were talking outside a session when he made the joke that, quote, "she was enjoying herself," being caged up with all the goblins around her. Or something along the lines of, quote, she was enjoying BDSM in a cage with goblins, which I shut him down for. Enough was enough, and I quit. Well, that story definitely falls into the realm of RPG horror story land. Between the overbearing difficulty, to not paying attention to rules like Fey ancestry and passive perception, to unavoidable traps to set the party in a certain direction, and the almost unsurvivable difficulty, it definitely sounds like this DM was railroading hardcore, and was doing the whole DM versus player type thing. And to just spring the KINK BDSM scene on players that didn't agree to that kind of campaign, it's just gross and creepy. I'm honestly surprised that OP lasted as long as he did in that game. It's stories like these that really make me appreciate the DMs I have for my games. Have you ever encountered a DM like this in any of your games? If so, let us know in the comments below. If you have a story that you would like read on the channel, you can post a link in the comments, post it to the channel subreddit r/DND Doge, or even just at me on Twitter. As always, I appreciate all of you and hope all your rolls are natural 20s. And always remember to thank your good DMs. Till next time.